Okay, so getting right into it. Today we're going deep on something pretty fascinating, I think, even for us. And that's the link between Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, and Walker-Warburg Syndrome.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting pairing for sure.
Now, we all probably already know a little something about ASD and how much it can vary from person to person.
Right, that whole spectrum idea.
Exactly. But the really surprising part, these two conditions, as different as they seem, they actually have some things in common.
That's definitely true. The overlaps are not what you'd expect.
Not at all.
But before we get too far into that, maybe we should make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to Walker-Warburg syndrome.
Yeah, good point.
So to put it simply, WWS is a genetic disorder, very rare, and it has a huge impact on how the brain and muscles develop.
Huge impact, meaning,
Meaning we're talking serious stuff here. It's not just like, oh, you might walk a little later or something. This is profound impact on a person's whole life.
okay, got it.
Yeah.
So not exactly a common thing to see then.
Not even close. Think of trying to find like one specific grain of sand on a whole beach. That's how rare we're talking.
Wow, okay. So something that uncommon, how on earth does it even get linked to something like ASD, which, while it has its own complexities, is relatively well known?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it really shows you how much we still don't know about the brain and how it can work in different ways.
I guess so. So spill the beans. What is this link then?
Well, one of the biggest connections, and it's a big one, is that both ASD and WWS can cause developmental delays.
Okay, so when we say developmental delays in this context, we're not just talking about like someone learned to ride a bike a bit later than their friends, right?
No, not at all. This is about some really crucial areas of development. Think communication, how you learn, how you interact with others. And these delays, they can have a ripple effect on a person's entire life, really.
So it's more than just like a checkbox on a doctor's chart or something. It's about how a person is able to actually live their life. Yeah.
Precisely. And what's so interesting is that these developmental delays, they can look pretty similar in people with ASD and WWS, but the reasons behind them, they're totally different.
Oh, that is interesting. So how so? Give us an example.
Sure. Let's say someone has a really hard time when their routine gets messed up. Like imagine your commute to work changes suddenly, or your favorite coffee shop closes down.
Oh, don't even joke about that last one. I rely on my routine.
Right, exactly. For most of us, it's an inconvenience, but for someone with ASD or WWS, that kind of change, it can be really overwhelming, even scary.
I get that. You just made those delays seem so real, even for someone like me who hasn't experienced them firsthand. Makes you realize how much we depend on things being predictable, you know?
Absolutely. And when that predictability goes out the window, it's way harder for someone with these conditions to just roll with it.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that's precisely why understanding how ASD and WWS overlap is so important. If we get that, then we can actually support people in a way that truly helps them.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've got these developmental delays, we've got the challenges with routines and changes. Anything else we should know about in terms of where these conditions kind of like converge?
There is one more, and you might be surprised by this one. It has to do with social interaction, which, as you know, is a major part of ASD.
Right, like one of the defining things about it, you could say.
Yep. But, and here's the thing, it turns out social interaction can also be really tough for people with Walker-Warburg syndrome, too.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that. So even though it's a core part of ASD, those social difficulties, it's not a given for everyone with WWSD, is what you're saying.
Exactly. With ASD, it's kind of baked in, you could say.
Mm.
But with WWS, it's more like it can happen because of those cognitive and developmental impacts we talked about earlier.
So it's like both roads kind of lead to the same destination sometimes, even if they start from different places.
Exactly. Think of it like trying to understand a whole other language, but without a dictionary or a translator app or anything.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to put it. Not impossible, but definitely adds a whole other level of difficulty.
You got it. And that's kind of the reality for people with these conditions, navigating a world that isn't always set up for the way their brains work.
I'm starting to get a better picture now, for sure. But hold on, we've been talking a lot about the similarities so far. If there are all these overlaps, then what actually separates these two? We are still talking about two different diagnoses, right?
You're absolutely right to bring that up. Knowing the differences is just as important as seeing where ASD and WWS intersect.
So hit us with it. What are those key distinctions?
Well, one of the most fundamental differences is where they each come from, their root cause, so to speak. ASD, we're still trying to figure out exactly what causes it. It seems to be this mix of genes a person is born with and the environment they grew up in. It's complicated.
A lot of factors at play. Makes sense.
Right, like a giant puzzle where we still haven't found all the pieces. But with WWS, it's more straightforward in a way. It's strongly linked to a person's genes, often very specific mutations.
Okay, so with ASD, it's like this big mystery we're trying to solve. And with WWS, we kind of have the blueprint, but it's still super complex.
You're getting it. And that difference in their origin, it changes how we understand and treat each condition. With ASD, we focus a lot on the behaviors, the communication styles, the stuff you can see.
Yeah, totally.
But with WWS, you're often dealing with things that go beyond just behavior. There can be physical differences you can see, and the impact on the brain, it's often more widespread. It affects multiple systems in the body, not just one thing.
So it's not just about how a person learns or interacts. It can actually impact their whole development from head to toe, so to speak.
Exactly. And this difference in how it affects the body leads us to another big distinction, which is the range of how severe it can be.
Okay, I'm following you. Lay it on me.
Well, with ASD, like the name says, it's a spectrum. You have folks who need a lot of support and folks who need very little and everything in between. With WWS, though, it usually involves more severe cognitive challenges.
So on the one side with ASD, you've got this wide range of possibilities, while on the other side with WWS, it tends to have a more profound impact on a person's development overall.
Yeah, you got it. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Because what do you think happens when someone has both?
Whoa, okay, yeah. That's where things have to get super complex, right? I mean, you're already dealing with two conditions that have so many different layers to them.
You're thinking about this exactly right. When ASD and WWS both present in the same person, things get very nuanced. And honestly, this is where our knowledge is still catching up. Because it's so rare, finding solid research on people who have both ASD and WWS, it's tough. It's not like there's tons of data out there yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can't really have a one-size-fits-all approach when each condition on its own is already so individual.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting clinically speaking, because support for these individuals has to be incredibly tailored.
So what does that look like in practice? How do you even start to build that kind of individualized support plan?
Well, it takes a lot of careful consideration, that's for sure. But one thing we know for sure is that teamwork is key. We're talking about a whole team of people coming together.
Like who? Give us the rundown.
So you've got educators, therapists, of course, the medical folks, and can't forget the family, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones living this every day. It really does take a village.
And each person on that team brings something unique to the table, I'm guessing. Like an educator would approach things differently from, say, a therapist. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You need people who get both ASD and WWS because they have to figure out a plan that works for that specific person, strengths and challenges and all that. And the family, they're the ones who know this person best. Their insights are invaluable.
Sounds like quite the balancing act to get everyone on the same page.
It can be, no doubt. It requires a deep understanding of both conditions, for sure.
Yeah.
But we can't lose sight of something really important here.
Well,
Families who are going through this, they aren't alone. There's support networks out there, places they can connect with others who get it, online forums, support groups, things like that. That shared experience can make a world of difference.
that sense of community can be so powerful, especially when you're dealing with something as rare as WWS. Knowing you're not alone in this journey, that's huge.
100%. And, speaking of not being alone, if someone's listening to us right now thinking, okay, all this is interesting and all, but what does it actually mean for me? What would you say to them?
That's a good question. I think I'd tell them it all goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Awareness. Even if you don't know anyone personally with ASD or WWS, just knowing these conditions exist and that the people who have them are just trying to navigate the world like everyone else, it matters.
Couldn't agree more. It's about creating a world where differences are accepted, not just tolerated.
I love that. And you never know, right? You might meet someone with ASD or WWS someday at work, in your community, even your own family. Wouldn't it be amazing to approach that interaction with openness and understanding instead of judgment?
Absolutely. That's what it's all about. We're all just trying to figure things out as we go, and a little kindness goes a long way.
It really does. But I think it goes even deeper than that, don't you think? It's not just about being kind, it's about being curious.
Ooh, I like that. Say more about that.
Well, it's like instead of shying away from what we don't understand, we should be leaning in, asking questions, challenging those preconceived notions we all have. Because when it comes down to it, we're all just trying to find our way in the world the best we can.
Beautifully said.
Hmm.
And, change happens one conversation, one interaction at a time.
Hmm.
Just like we're doing right now, right? Having this conversation.
It's true. And speaking of conversations, as we've been talking about ASD and WWS, I'm struck by how connected everything feels within the whole realm of neurodiversity. It's less about these individual conditions existing in isolation and more about how they relate to one another, you know?
That is such a great point, and it really gets at why understanding these connections is so crucial. When we start seeing those links, it makes you realize that sometimes our diagnostic categories, while helpful, they can be a bit limiting too. They don't always capture the full picture of a person.
Right. It's like those Venn diagrams we used to draw in school. Remember those? You've got the two circles and then that overlapping section in the middle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's often in those overlapping areas where the lines get blurry, that's where the most interesting stuff happens.
Totally. Because that's where we're forced to question what we think we know and be open to different perspectives.
And ultimately, that's how we embrace the incredible diversity of human experience.
I love that. It's all connected, isn't it? So we've talked about the specifics of ASD and WWS, really gotten into the weeds of how they're similar and how they're different. But as we start to wrap up our deep dive here, I've got to ask you, what's a question you're still wrestling with? Something that keeps you up at night when it comes to these conditions?
Ooh, that's a big one. What keeps me up at night? I'd have to say the question that's always on my mind is, how do we get to a place where neurodiversity in all its forms, ASD, WWS, all of it, isn't just like accepted, but truly valued?
Wow, that is a big one. It's almost like we have to change how we think as a society, you know?
Yeah, it's not something you can fix with a pill or a therapy session. It's a journey we all have to take, learning and unlearning and relearning about ourselves and each other.
It's about changing our whole perspective.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into ASD and WWS. It's been quite a journey, even for us.
It really has.
And remember, folks, knowledge is just the beginning. What we do with that knowledge, how we use it to build a world that's more inclusive, more understanding, well, that's what really counts. So keep asking those questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep those minds open. There's so much to learn out there, and it all starts with that curiosity.